London Metropolitan Archives holds records for many of London's historic healthcare providers. The majority of these records date from the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, but we also have a few from as early as the 1550s. We have over 80 individual hospital collections, ranging from St Thomas's Hospital, Lambeth, to Mile End Hospital in Tower Hamlets, and from the City of London Maternity Hospital to the Royal London Homeopathic Hospital in Bloomsbury. To this body of records, we can add those from the London Poor Law Boards and County Council health departments, which were set up to fund, manage and scrutinise the way that health services were being run in the capital. So it may be that we actually have tens of thousands of individual records in our collections that contain evidence about London's healthcare. In this talk, I'm going to offer you an outline history of the way that hospital services developed in the capital before the NHS was set up. I'll be using a simple scheme to group hospitals into several different types. These are broad types and they don't cover every hospital, but I think they're the key groups. The other thing I'm going to do this afternoon is to describe the range of record types that we hold and offer some approaches to searching for them in our catalogue. My main aim is to introduce our hospital holdings to people who might want to use them for research, whether this is formal or informal. The content of this talk closely reflects existing sources of information, such as our research guides, which you can access online after the talk. However, even if you don't want to visit to do research whenever that becomes possible again, I hope that I might be able to add to your existing understanding of London and the experiences of its people by talking to you today about the hospitals which serve them. The bubble in this scheme refers to one of four main hospital types, and it starts top left with the voluntary hospitals. The best known of these hospitals are those which have gone on to become our great London teaching hospitals. Below them is a group of hospitals which were set up and run by the Metropolitan Asylums Board, or MAB, and these include services for people with tuberculosis and other contagious diseases. Bottom, we have the county mental hospitals, many of which were outside of the central London area. And then top, we have the local general hospitals, which were first run as workhouse infirmaries and then later run by London County Council as district general hospitals. As I talk about each of these types of provision, we will start to see how bodies like London County Council and the Metropolitan Asylums Board shaped the way that the London network developed. So significant were their achievements and those of the individual hospitals themselves, that by 1948, when the NHS was launched, London's healthcare was already the envy of the world. I'm going to go on now to look at each of these groups in a bit more detail, starting with the voluntary hospitals. 19th century and onwards, many independent charitable hospitals and dispensaries were founded to provide free healthcare for the poor. Westminster Hospital was amongst the first, set up in 1719, followed by Giles, St George's, the London Hospital, which is now the Royal London Hospital, and the Middlesex Hospital. Taking out a subscription to support these hospitals conferred the right to nominate patients for treatment. So in 1893, a lifetime subscription of £31 10 to the London Hospital would allow you to recommend 16 patients a year. These patients would have included ordinary working people who had probably lost their regular income because of acute ill health or injury, but they would not have usually included the very poorest. Medical staff gave their services free of charge for the considerable payoff of gaining a good professional reputation. These hospitals also led the way in training their own nurses and setting up medical schools. In addition to Guy's, St George's and Westminster, LMA also holds the records of many smaller hospitals that started out as voluntary hospitals. These include Bolingbroke Hospital in Battersea and the Royal Northern Hospital, which was set up to treat injured and sick railway workers. What about wealthy people? Where did they get their treatment in this period? The truth is that before the age of modern science-based healthcare, few people went to hospital if they could afford to be cared for at home. The likelihood of getting an infection in hospital and dying from it was just too great a risk. And in any case, most hospital treatments, most medical treatments at that time could be given successfully in a domestic setting. Indeed, before the advent of modern operating facilities, it was probably safer even to have a surgical procedure in a nice clean room at home. I'd like to mention one other category of large London hospitals, and that's the Royal Hospitals. The Royal Hospitals, famous London hospitals like St Bartholomew's and St Thomas's, and this is a picture of St Thomas's here, sometimes get lumped in with the voluntary hospitals. However, their roots are different, being in the medieval monastic traditions of offering refuge to the sick, the poor, and to travellers. This was originally referred to as hospitality, and you may well know that this is where we get the word hospital from. These hospitals benefited from royal patronage and long-term endowments. Barts, for example, is the oldest London hospital and was built on land granted by Henry I. LMA does not hold Barts records. These are with the Archives Service of the Barts and Royal London Hospital Trust. But we do hold the records of St Thomas's Hospital and the Nightingale Training School with which it was associated. Like so many of our ancient institutions, the Royal Hospitals thrived during the British colonial period, and profits from the trade in human slaves helped fund their services. Recently, Giles and St Thomas's gave a commitment to revisit that aspects of their history. As part of that, it acknowledges the impacts of racism on its policies and practices, recognising it as an ongoing legacy of that history. So next I'd like to move on to talk about the works of the Metropolitan Asylums Board and the hospital services that it set up. In 1867, the Metropolitan Poor Act was passed. Both Florence Nightingale and the Lancet newspaper were instrumental in bringing this legislation about by reporting on the insanitary and overcrowded conditions in the workhouse. As well as the homeless and unemployed, the workhouse wards were also where the poorest of London's acutely ill patients were accommodated, together with the chronically sick, the elderly and the infirm. Amongst other things, the 1867 Act led to the establishment of the Metropolitan Asylums Board, or MAB. The role of MAB was to manage the Metropolitan Asylums District, coordinating existing hospital provision and building its own hospitals. Of particular concern was the need to manage outbreaks of smallpox and other diseases such as typhoid and cholera. Outbreaks of these killer diseases presented too big a problem for individual workhouse guardians, and London was getting sicker and sicker as a consequence. This image shows the truly splendid MAB office on Victoria Embankment in a picture from the 1930s. I think its grandness indicates the degree of responsibility that was placed on the board. You might notice the sign on the front of the building showing that it was for sale by the LCC, so clearly a reorganisation was afoot at this point. In the next slide, I'm going to show you the range of illnesses which the MAB board had to tackle, and really it was quite daunting. What we have here is a summary of the conditions that the new MAB hospitals needed to deal with. Fever was a general term for the many infectious diseases that people were vulnerable to in the 19th century. Those which were caused by bacteria ran rampant in the age before effective disinfection, good sanitation, or antibiotics. But there were dangerous viral infections too, of which smallpox could be amongst the most destructive. About 7 out of 10 people who got smallpox survived, although they could be horribly disfigured and even left blind. The main problem, and this might sound familiar, was its sheer virulence, and the setting up of hospitals for highly infectious patients was not at all popular with local residents. So significant was the move to take on these diseases that Geoffrey Rivet, who's the writer of the definitive volume on the London hospital history, argued that to the poor law fever hospitals belongs the distinction of being the first centrally planned hospital services in London. There's a couple of terms in this chart that you might not be familiar with. And so I just picked a couple out. Erysipelas is one. That was a bacterial skin infection that produced a nasty red rash, especially on the face. And the other one, another one I picked out is marasmus, which was the long-term debilitating effects of infant malnutrition, which included stunted growth, delayed development, and very weak lungs. What you will notice in this chart, however, is that although MAB was called the Asylums Board, it didn't set up mental hospitals. It did provide for the feeble-minded and the imbecile, to use the entirely contemporary terms, but the mental hospitals have a different history. With the passing of Lunacy Acts in 1845 and again in 1890, the responsibility for providing for people with mental illness passed to the county councils. From 1808, local authorities have been able to charge a rate for treating the mentally ill, but the workhouse wards which provided for these people remained totally inadequate. The County of Middlesex authorities set up 3 large mental hospitals: Camberwell Asylum, also known as St Bernard's Hospital, Colney Hatch Asylum, later known as Frian Hospital, which is shown here, and Banstead Asylum. After London County Council was established, it took over all the Middlesex hospitals and some of the Surrey ones. By 1930, the LCC ran 22 large mental hospitals. Here we see the imposing frontage of Middlesex County per lunatic asylum, later known as Frian Hospital. When it opened, this 1,250-bed hospital was the largest in Europe, and it expanded continuously as demand grew. It had a special responsibility for treating Jewish patients and had a role in treating servicemen who'd been mentally traumatized during the First World War. Like most of these hospitals, Frian was designed to be self-contained. Farm operations with livestock and agricultural land, a dairy, huge kitchens and bakeries, tailoring and needlework shops were all typical of these institutions. An infirmary for sick patients and on-site dental and surgical facilities were often featured, together with occupational therapy units, gymnasia, and acres of grounds. And I hope you can see just bottom right of this picture, they also probably had lots of cats as well. The story of the Victorian Mental Hospital needs much more attention than I can give it here. But I can tell you that we hold the records for Frian Hospital, a big collection of records for Frian Hospital. We hold them for Banstead and Camberwell hospitals too, and the City of London Mental Hospital at Stone House. So let's go on now to look at the last category of hospitals, the local general hospitals. So, interlinked problems of poverty, hunger, homelessness, and ill health have preoccupied civic authorities ever since they first existed. Here we're talking about the health of those people really very low down the social scale, the day labourers, the piece workers, the laundresses, right down to the completely destitute street dweller. By the middle of the 19th century, provision for the sick in the workhouse was recognised as nothing short of disgraceful. It was inadequate in every sense, underfunded, and staffed mostly by attendants with little clinical training. Although not universally so, I don't think we need to worry about overstating just how awful some of these places might have been. Again, with the passing of the 1867 Metropolitan Poor Act, local boards of guardians were charged with replacing the old sick wards with professionally run infirmaries under the control of a medical superintendent. They were to be administered separately from the workhouse, but still reported back to the Poor Law boards. It's really with the development of these infirmaries that we start to see the foundation of a system of local general hospitals in London, a process reflected elsewhere in the country. The infirmaries were to be local, treatment focused, and purpose-built with good ventilation and enough space. Over the next 30 years, there was a revolution in hospital care at a local level, moving on from provision in the grim-looking buildings like the one above. This is Hackney Union casual wards, which had rooms for the sick, and instead, the new infirmary buildings, like the one we see in the next picture, made a clear statement of the intent to improve healthcare for the poor. So this is St Pancras Hospital. It may be very familiar to a lot of you, and it was established as St Pancras Workhouse Infirmary. This is just the front view of a huge hospital site, which is still there, and it still provides healthcare in some of its original buildings today. The next chapter of the general hospital history brings us back to London County Council. The infirmaries continue to serve their communities under the direction of the local Poor Law boards until 1930, when they were taken over by London County Council. Deep within the archives of the LCC Public Health Department and in LCC committee records, we have the story of that takeover. It has been written about a lot, this subject, but I think there's still a major history to be written there. This was a major undertaking, leading to the refurbishment of many hospitals to a very high standard for the time. The training of nurses and medical staff continued apace in these settings, and they became hubs for wider healthcare programmes. This picture shows St Giles Hospital in Camberwell, and it's actually one of my favourite hospital pictures, taken, I think, after a significant upgrade under the LCC. It looks like a hospital which is really proud of itself, and I'm sure it was because it would have been a state-of-the-art institution at the time. Most of these hospitals became NHS hospitals. The records of many former workhouse infirmaries and of the hospitals that they were to become are held at LMA. As well as this one, St Giles, collections include Edgware General Hospital, Lambeth Hospital, the North Middlesex, St Mary Abbott's Hospital, and St Olave's Hospital, Rotherhithe. I do just have time to talk about one specific branch of local hospital provision, which the LCC was instrumental in establishing, and this was the hospital maternity units. In 1949, the LCC published a small volume which reviewed hospital provision in the capital, and it singled out the development of general hospital maternity units as something to celebrate. The workhouse infirmaries had offered somewhere for poor women to give birth, but by the 1930s they could not cope with demand. They sometimes sent women to the largely independent lying-in hospitals which had existed for some time. However, these hospitals fought to continue to cater only for decent women, in inverted commas, by which they meant married women. So again, in 1930, the LCC inherited 600 beds from the Poor Law boards, which had been used for women in labour, and set about creating a London-wide maternity service. Providing these services was fraught with problems, which included persistently high rates of infant and maternal mortality, especially from puerperal sepsis, a systemic infection arising directly from childbirth. Most worrying, however, was the fact that standards of care and outcome for women in these units was very uneven. Some units were excellent, but others even lacked decent buildings. As you can see here, this picture of St Nicholas's Hospital shows the development of a brand new maternity block in 1940. Many of these units still had too few trained midwives, while others offered only minimal antenatal care. Many lacked any doctors with specialist skills. As an authority which promoted both public health and individual health, The LCC also realised that maternity units had to be able to deal with all the medical needs of the mothers and babies they cared for. Tuberculosis and venereal disease, for example, were common complications of childbirth before effective antibiotic therapy. Social, financial and family problems were also grave concerns. One of the great achievements of these services, however, was in the development of effective pain relief for women in labour. Moving on from chloroform, which must have been really awful, the LCC quickly adopted the use of gas and air apparatus with great success. And I believe the first kind of apparatus was called the Minute gas and air apparatus. I want to show you this section of a map which was created by the King Edward's Hospital Fund for London. Its aim was to demonstrate the extent and diversity of hospital provision in the capital during the time of the LCC, and this section just shows Central and South London. And I chose showing South London particularly because I think we're often very guilty of just showing North London. I took that executive decision here. By using symbols, each hospital is categorised by size, purpose and specialism, and whether or not they taught medical students or even had their own medical schools. Links to the regional health boards, which group different types of hospital in the same locality, are also shown. Let me show you now the key to the map on the next slide, which helps explain this system a bit. The reference key gives a sense of the organisational structure which had been imposed on the hospital network. I think the most common symbol on the map appears to be the solid blue square, which denotes a general hospital over 50 beds run by a regional health board. And I think that's probably followed by the ones with the red square, which means a large general teaching hospital. So we're back to the map, and I think you'll see the dark blue squares are quite prominent there, and the red squares, obviously there's fewer of those because they're very big hospitals. The main point about this map, which was actually published in 1951, is that it gives a picture of the vast range of existing services that were actually inherited by the NHS in 1948, which were then went on to be developed from there. So that's the end of this part of the talk. I'm now going to move on to describe some strategies for identifying hospital records in our collections, starting with this summary list of the kind of records you might find. So I've started with patient records because they, I think, are the most popular records. So the things we get asked about more than the other records. So we hold registers of all kinds about the admission and discharge of patients. And we occasionally find treatment registers where there are particular kinds of treatments that the hospital gave. One kind of treatment which was unusual but widely used for a period of time was treatment with malaria for chronic syphilis. What you will notice is that I haven't listed individual patient files as being common in these collections. They're really a bit of a rarity as the survival of such records is generally quite poor. Having said that, small samples of files can appear in collections. Any patient records which could possibly concern people who are living are closed under data protection rules. However, living people can access their own records. The second class of records is clinical records. These may or may not refer to individual patients, but they're really about the work of the practitioners that created them. Medical journals are good examples, being diaries of clinical practice. We hold admin and management records of all kinds, and sometimes these records are very well represented in a collection, sometimes they're quite patchy. Next we have building records. Again, you'll notice that I've not listed original building plans as being very common. This is because the design and buildings of hospitals went on before the hospitals were opened. So the records may never have actually belonged to the hospital management boards. They might, however, exist in other archives. Almost all hospitals had, and indeed still have, a charitable arm. There is some evocative ephemera in our hospital collections, including the very first picture in this presentation I showed you of the lady selling flags. to raise money for the London Hospital. What it says on the front of her tray is "Wanted by the London Hospital, every penny you can spare." What I can't see, and it's very frustrating, is exactly what's written under the hospital name. I'd like to think it says something like "the biggest in England," but I don't know if that's the case. Again, this is a real favourite picture of mine. So now, using some typical questions that we might get asked about our hospital records, I'm going to run through some search strategies for using in our online catalogue. So we do actually get asked very general questions like this. And because of that, we have a lot of lists and indexes at LMA that can help guide people through our hospital collections. There's also the National Archives Discovery website and an offshoot of that called the Hospital Records Database, which can help in tracking down hospital records in any archive. But in this case, I think I would suggest going straight to our catalogue, not for a detailed search, for a bit of a browse. So this is the top part of the main homepage for our catalogue. I will give you the web address for that at the end of the talk. Now, instead of using the search bar to look for something, which is very good if you know what you're looking for, in this case, you would choose more search options and items listed in. You will see that this window offers you the chance to browse the archives. And you do that by clicking on that little black arrow, and it will take you to this window. The Browse the Archive function allows you to choose one of the 26 broad classifications that all our records fit into. As well as hospitals, there are categories for businesses, charities, courts, and many more. In this case, we're going to choose hospitals, and when we click Go, it will take us to an A to Z list of all of the collections that we have classified as hospital collections, and here it is. This image shows the first 10 of over 80 collections which we have classified as hospital collections, and you'll notice that all the reference numbers begin with an H. Each one of these titles is a live link into the collections catalogue. If I can get you just to take a look at this list for a moment and make a mental note of the first 3 hospital names that begin with a B. I'll be coming back to that shortly. So that is the Browse by Category function. The next question I'm going to explore is about records from particular hospitals. Now, in this case, we have a hospital name, and in the first instance, you could do worse than just use the basic search bar that we saw on that first catalogue window and search for Free and Hospital. And if we do that, we will indeed get an entry for that hospital. In addition to the catalogue reference, which you'll see is H12CH, which is really important for navigating through the catalogue, this summary entry tells us several other useful things. This includes all the alternative names which I've mentioned earlier, so Colney Hatch and Middlesex County Pauper Asylum. So a search using those names would probably have worked too. Now, the types of records in this collection can be seen in the scope and content field, but what you can't see are the individual entries for each individual document. To see those, you need to open up the collections tree view, and you do that by clicking on the little drop-down menu on the right-hand side alongside collections tree view. See this document in context. So when we do that, we can see that there are many series of records in this collection to choose from, starting with the records of administration. I've chosen to look at the records that are in the series Administration, Clerks, Diaries, because I thought that sounded really interesting. And I've just done that by clicking on that little arrow on the left-hand side. I think this sounds like a really fascinating document, Clerk's Diary, including a list of patients admitted, discharged and died, and entries relating to a fire in the annex in 1903, in which 51 patients died. If there is one thing that you can say about hospital records, is they're sometimes very routine, but they can be very unusual and surprising as well. That then is how to use the collections tree. and it really doesn't take a lot of practice to become quite familiar with it. The bottom line is that if there is a drop-down arrow in the collection tree, it will usually take you to more detailed information about records in the collection. And so now on to my last question. This is quite a typical question we might get sent in to us by email or might even answer over the phone. So I think you hold the records of Bethnal Green Hospital, but I can't find them in the catalogue. I need them for about 1900. So cast your mind back to the list of hospital titles beginning with B, which we found through the browse function, and you may recall that there wasn't an entry for Bethnal Green Hospital. The dates are interesting too, because it's before 1930, when the LCC took over the workhouse infirmaries. I would probably do some get some background information on this hospital before trying to search. So maybe use the hospital records database or one of the summary lists. However, published sources can also be a quick way of doing this. And in fact, I'm going to go straight to Cliff Webb's Index of London Hospitals and their records published by the Society of Genealogists. This is a really invaluable book, and I just didn't think I could do this talk without acknowledging it. It's in many editions now, including this one, which I use, which is an ebook, and it's published by the Society of Genealogists. An entry in this little book shows that Bethnal Green was actually opened in 1900 as Bethnal Green Poor Law Infirmary, and was then later taken over by the LCC. So when I search for Bethnal Green Infirmary, on the next slide, we see one of the entries that came up. So this is the catalogue entry that I've chosen to show you. You can see that we do in fact hold records for this hospital, but it's not in one of the hospital categories. It doesn't have an H reference. Also, all of the information we discovered from our background research is in this entry, but it's not in a really standard way. It might be a little bit difficult to find this if you were trying to search for it as an individual record. The entry also gives you information about access to the records on microfilm and on ancestry.co.uk. It's just worth mentioning that this is about a hospital and it's on Ancestry, but because of potential data protection regulations, you won't really find any of the H hospital collections on Ancestry. The moral of this story is that yes, we may have records that concern hospitals, but they're not listed as hospitals with an H reference. So, on to the next slide, please. And I promised to give you the web address for our catalogue, and here it is. From the catalogue homepage, you can search, browse, use advanced search options, explore some of our digitised documents, and find out more about our services. You can also access all of our research guides, including the 4 that I've shown here, which contain lots of information about the hospital records we care for at LMA, and which I've drawn on extensively for this talk.